Okay, we're looking at the Bataille PME Rules for Napoleonic Grand Tactical Warfare, 1792 to 1815. We're going to look at defensive, as in defensive fire. Although the following sequence may seem rigid, the sequence of play or chronology of battle, it is important to note that in every part of the chronology of battle there will be noteworthy events, which may result in dynamic changes to the action portrayed. Thus, in a manner, the defensive fire of a unit may dramatically affect the momentum of a charge by cavalry and force a major shift in tactics or strategy. So during the sequence, for one player than the other, there is a defensive fire phase or segment after movement, but before offensive fire. Leader casualties. The leader may be affected by the outcome of a combat result during offensive or defensive fire, or during melee. There's a possibility of a leader casualty. The zone of influence. The zone is the area in front of the unit, the one hex, that affects enemy movement. Yes. Defensive fire, opportunity, and reaction charges. There is one exception to this rule. Infantry in a square does not exert a zone of influence, yet units moving adjacent to the square are subject to defensive fire as they exit the hex or make organizational orientation or formation changes. All units in an enemy zone of influence may receive defensive fire from his opponent during the defensive fire segment of the turn. Foot artillery and infantry units may only exit an enemy zone of influence at the beginning of their movement phase. And to do so will provoke a defensive fire attack on them. Only at the beginning of their movement phase. When exiting an enemy zone of influence hex, the non-phasing player may make a defensive fire attack on the exiting combat unit. These defensive fire attacks are called opportunity fires. Okay. Opportunity fire attacks are just like defensive fire attacks that happen in the defensive fire phase of the chronology of battle, including fire value calculation, column shifts, etc. Cavalry units wishing to assault a square must actually rest in the same hex as the square and have suffered defensive fire. When firing at a target 2 hexes distant, the fire is halved. This is for skirmishers. In order to initiate opportunity or defensive fire, enemy units must be adjacent to the infantry skirmishers. They must retreat into the aforementioned hexes and do so without giving defensive fire or checking morale. This is retreat before cavalry for skirmishers. When an enemy combat formation moves adjacent to cavalry skirmishers, the tirailleur may fire and retreat before offensive fire if the enemy unit is not an unlimbering artillery unit or cavalry tirailleur. This retreat occurs after defensive fire by the tirailleurs, but before the offensive fire of the phasing player. If the enemy moving adjacent unit is unlimbering enemy artillery, the cavalry skirmishers may fire before the artillery unit unlimbers, opportunity fire, and then remain to give defensive fire on the unlimbered artillery, then retreat 1 hex, but must face offensive fire due to the nature of artillery range. Fire combat from either musket or cannon was often the preliminary of the offensive assault, while defensive fire was used to blunt the attacking forces. Defensive fire. Any combat formation with a fire factor that has an enemy combat formation adjacent to one of his front hex sides may fire defensively in the appropriate segment of the chronology of battle at the enemy formation. Defensive fire differs from offensive fire only in that it must be made against adjacent targets and therefore has a range of 1. Units only give fire once during the defensive fire segment of the chronology of battle. Units which are thus attacked may not give defensive fire, nor may they change formation unless so mentioned in special rules. This is in relation to the attacker. May always advance into the first vacated hex following a retreat prior to melee and initiate 1 more melee assault. Okay. If the infantry succeeds in this check, the cavalry charged is halted. Infantry in this case are considered to have passed their pre-melee morale check, and things stop until the defensive fire phase. If this infantry unit fails to pass the morale check and disorders, it will stand in the hex where it is. The cavalry is then adjacent to the infantry, and things stop, pause, until the defensive fire phase and melee. Following defensive fire, melee between the cavalry and infantry is completed. Infantry formed square. Carré. If it was not the declared target of a charge, the infantry stands. The cavalry may charge other units, move over the top of the square, and through this square move to another hex or hexes, accepting defensive fire, move in another direction, or halt. If the infantry was a declared target, the cavalry must advance until it is adjacent to the infantry square. Then the cavalry moves on top of the square and suffers defensive fire, and charge movement ends. Once in the hex with the square, cavalry must suffer defensive fire according to the defensive fire rules. After suffering ill effects of the defensive fire, the cavalry must melee the defensive square in the melee phase. Okay, infantry disordered. Neither unit may move in the movement segment. Defensive fire and melee. Defensive fire and melee. The cavalry melees the infantry in the melee assault phase. The same process found in the regular charge sequence above is used for the infantry or artillery that attempts to stand. Make a morale check. If successful, then there is defensive fire and melee. If unsuccessful, the infantry cavalry routes. And retreats away its remaining movement. When the artillery is alone in a hex. If the artillery is alone in a hex and is unlimbered, bring the charging cavalry adjacent to the guns. If it is a front hex of the guns, make a modified morale check with the artillery, and if the guns succeed in passing their check, proceed to defensive fire, then melee in the appropriate phase. Following movement, the guns may fire if the cavalry is at their front or the artillery is in square. Melee would proceed after all defensive and offensive fire. Following the sequence of defense and offensive fire and melee, apply results to both the attacker and defender.